Welcome to One Broken Mom, a podcast dedicated to raising awareness of mental health, parenting, and self-improvement. I am the host, Ameé Coney. One Broken Mom is not a family show. It is meant for adults and contains sometimes adult language. The topics I cover can be serious and unsettling to people. However, I do have a sense of humor laced with a little bit of a punk rock attitude. So if you're interested in real talks about real stuff by real people so that we can all get better together, well, then you're in the right place, and so welcome. Okay, everyone, welcome back to this episode of One Broken Mom. I am really honored to have with me Dr. Margaret Rutherford. She's been a psychologist and having her own practice for over 25 years, and she recently just published a book in the fall of 2019 called Perfectly Hidden Depression: How to Break Free from the Perfectionism That Masks Your Depression. I have her on the show today because I've heard from many of my listeners, and I have also been personally had a front row seat to the topic of enmeshment. From subtleties to extremes. And I've, unfortunately been victimized by people who were victims themselves of this dynamic and know full well of the costs and the dangers that it plays in our lives. And I came upon Dr. Rutherford, Margaret's work, because she had written an article about it, and I'll have a link to the article in the podcast notes here. And as we had emailed back and forth, she had expressed that she'd had some personal experience with it. And so I'm looking forward to this. I say that a lot on all my episodes. I'm always looking forward to my episodes. This one I think will be particularly intriguing. I'd like for my parents that are listening to this to really take away some good stuff about their relationships with their children, hopefully to dispel the fear of connection with our kids. But for those of you that have this dynamic at play presently in your life or have had to deal with it in your family, I'm hoping that we can come up with some ideas and some understanding of what happens in this condition, I guess, for lack of a better word. So welcome to the show, Margaret.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd call it dynamic probably, since it's not a medical condition.
Right.
But, the interesting thing, is that one of the problems with the dynamic again of enmeshment is that to those living it, it doesn't look like a problem to them. It's probably people who enmesh themselves with their children may have come from enmeshed relationships with their own parents, and it's what they believe is love. That sort of lack of boundary. There's where your child begins and you end is very vague. Mm-hmm. So, and we can talk more about the specifics, but it's. One thing when you're depressed or when you have a panic attack or something like that, we can tell something's wrong. I'm not myself. This isn't right. I am struggling. And yet enmeshment is often really even culturally considered, wow, you and your mom or you and your dad are so close. And that's so wonderful. But there are definitely some problems with enmeshment.
Oh yeah, for sure. And, and I think about family systems theory. I've got a book that I'm working on too, that's mostly a business book, but, the topic of differentiation comes up in there. And,
sure.
And the idea of the whole family unit nervous system, of everybody's parts. And, a lot of people don't realize that there is a nervous system, like there's a family, system in there that we are all wired to kind of interact with one another. And I know that then there's this ideology that then gets passed along, which is that you don't want to have too close of a relationship with your children because you don't want to ruin them. You don't want to air quote, spoil them. There's a lot of really negative and hostile dialogue, in culture today about, the generation, they pick on the millennials because, they seem like they got gold stars.
Those poor millennials.
Oh, I know.
They do get picked on a lot.
They do. They really do. And so there's this swinging of like, well, I don't want to spoil my kids, so let's just leave them to the wolves, kind of an idea. And I've covered this topic as well, especially when it comes to boys, that you don't want to coddle them and you toughen them up and all that stuff. And so I would imagine that people that are listening to this that are actually parents, may feel this sense of anxiety that there's a fine line between having this healthy connected relationship with their children and then slipping into this super toxic dynamic of enmeshment. But I have to believe that it's not a fine line. Like, it's not like you can accidentally go too far. Like, that there's a really robust, healthy connection. And then you have to really make a huge leap to get into enmeshment. But you're the expert. So can you help describe what those differences really do look like?
Well, what you just said made me think of several things. And one of them is that you mentioned family systems theory, which is it's a psychological theory that addresses family dynamics and family communication style and just what roles do people play in their families. And so it's a whole way of looking at psychology. Those particular therapists usually, in fact, have all the family come in. I mean, literally the children, the dog, the grandparents, if they're living there, everybody comes to the therapy session. And so, and I was trained in that model in graduate school. I did a year of study at the Southwest Family Institute there in Dallas. And really, there are two poles of family systems theory. And I'm going to mention one by Robert Beavers, where, and I don't want to get too technical, but basically there are two kinds of families that are on either end of that distribution. And one of them is called a centripetal family. Centripetal, like the force going inward. Mm-hmm. And you're going to get enmeshment in those kinds of families. There's families that tell you things like, at the most severe, you can only trust family, or, there are families who don't allow their kids really, or even support their kids doing too much outside the family, or there's sort of, there's a lot of questioning. Well, why can't you talk to me about that? Why would you need to talk to your friend about that? The other pole is what's called the centrifugal family, where the energy is going outward, right? In those families, they say, get a job at 13. And, my dad and I, your dad and I can't support you past high school, or there's so little emotional connection in the family that actually kids have to go outside of the family for any kind of intimacy. So you got these families where all the energy is going inward, and you got the families where all the energy is going outward. Of course, healthy families are somewhere in the middle, right? Yeah. So I think that's what you're talking about, is how subtly does that happen, where you go from really having a healthy relationship with your child and where you cross the line. One of the things then I thought about was a lot of parents suffer, understandably in many ways, with believing that their children are an extension of them. Mm-hmm. And this happens especially with enmeshed parents, where if Johnny wins the spelling bee, it means that you've been a good dad, that you obviously should be proud of yourself. Or if whatever accomplishment there is, or whatever failure there is, or whatever struggle there is, you see that as about the quality of your parenting. Now, it might have something to do with the quality of your parenting, but when there's very little line between you and your child, for example, let's say your daughter is becoming a teenager, and in its the most severe form, enmeshment can look like the mom that goes out with her teenage girl and her friends, or dresses like them, or doesn't allow that young woman to come into her own. I worked with a man many years ago now and he was in his 30s or 40s, and he did everything with his father. Everything. And I looked at him at one time in the session and said, "You're kind of married to your dad." And he said, "Well, I'm worried about what my dad would be like if I didn't include him." And I said, that's, there's almost that sense of obligation mm-hmm. when you're the enmeshed child, that you're doing something wrong by growing up and growing away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so is there, you mentioned boundaries, and that's, sure. One of the I've got a dozen questions here for you.
Sure.
But, we talk a lot about that on the show. So that concept won't be new to anybody that's listening here. But, the idea that there's an extension that, the parents just can't see you, in your own autonomous form. And so, of course, we all are learning, those of us that, create the show and listen to the show are all learning about boundaries and how to recreate those boundaries. And so you are describing this as if there's just no distinction between how you view your kids and what they are as humans, and you can't see them as an individual human, then there is a maybe some work on your sense of self here, because I can see that some people, not everybody is of a toxic personality. I want to put that out there, but sometimes if we have that dynamic and it is wired into us because of that relationship, we don't, like you said, view it as maybe a bad thing, because
Right.
that's just the way, our family, was set up and stuff. So again, I don't want to freak parents out, about that, for them to not want to pat themselves on the back because their kid did do something good, because maybe they
Sure.
did put
Sure.
in some effort, right?
Sure.
To
Of
help
course.
them to get through that. Um,
Well, let's talk a little bit about just enmeshment in general,
mhm,
and let's sort of define it. In fact, there's a great book called The Emotional Incest Syndrome
mhm,
that's written by Dr. Pat Love that turned me onto a lot of things. There's also an older book that's a much harder read, kind of boring, in fact, at the beginning. It's called The Drama of the Gifted Child.
yeah.
And the emotional incest syndrome was sort of a popularized version of the drama of the gifted child. But basically what happens in enmeshment is that a parent, usually a parent, um, pulls a child in to the dynamic where for their own self gain, meaning that they will look at the child and say things like, "There's no one who makes me as happy as you do," or "I've never felt more love than I have, from you," and so the child is given the job, so to speak, of pleasing the parent and of even being their confidant, being someone the parent can count on. So, sometimes actually taking the place of the husband or wife, and who really should have that role in a healthier family. But what this sets up is that the parent who's doing the enmeshing, they have adult problems. Their children can't do anything about those adult problems. If your mother or your father has low self-esteem, if they struggle with anxiety, or if they have an alcohol problem, or whatever it is, a child can't solve those problems. In reality, you can be told umpteen hundred times how much your presence in their life means to them, but you don't have the power to fix
Mhm,
their problem. So this is what happens. You're given the job, but you always fail at the job
mhm,
because your parent really isn't happy. So you just keep pouring more energy
mhm,
into trying to make them happy, or trying to make their lives better, and actually feel like you're abandoning them when you say, for example, that you want to go to a college far away, or you're going to join the military, or you're going to do something that's more about your own independence, or about your own goals. And the parent can become, you know, quite agitated about that, or not even supportive. And again, this may vary. And for example, these are the parents and children who talk or text, I mean, a lot of times per day, and see it as normal,
mhm,
and don't even see that. In fact, I live in a college town, Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I have a fair amount of college students as patients. And someone will say, "Well, I hate being at the university." And I said, "Well, why?" "I can't make any friends." And so I start talking to them about what kind of relationship they have with their parents, or a parent. And they say, "Oh, I talk to my mom all the time." Well, like, how often is that? "Oh gosh, 8 or 10 times a day we text, or we at least have a conversation." And my comment to them is, "So what about the person walking next to you to class?" Now, I know I'm older. I love texting, don't get me wrong. But, maybe you could walk into class and go, "Hey, I'm Margaret," or, whatever. You're counting on your parent to remain your foundation. And the parent is quite willingly doing that. So the dynamics are hurtful, and even they may not seem hurtful to the now even adult child who's pulled into the parental need, and that can just be devastating. It also can give the message, maybe inadvertently, but it can give the message that the child needs the parent.
mhm,
They need their involvement. So I was hugely affected by this, that I didn't realize that I even could live my own life,
mhm.
that I could make good decisions. I was so accustomed to running those decisions by my parent that once I got out in the real world, I made terrible decisions because I had not learned about my own process for making decisions, and just counted on especially my mom, way too much.
Mm-hmm. And and I wanted you to be able to share that experience, because I think it,
Sure.
when I do see people that write into me, and again, you're the expert here, does it tend to be experiences with
I have the
mothers?
letters after my name. That's it.
That's okay. All right. All we can talk about is our war stories, right? But with this enmeshment, and I didn't use the word emotional incest, but I have heard it, because it sounds really icky and gross,
Thank Yeah, that's
and
why
it
she
kind
sold a
of,
lot of books.
right. Yeah, it does. Right. And so, but yet it also drives conversations away from, I think it pushes people away from talking about this. And so I'm glad you brought it up, because that is another word, and that it kind of does stir a bad feeling in you, because sometimes that kind of what it is. It's to have to be that emotional confidant, for a parent. And so, I'm curious about whether or not, does enmeshment tend to occur with a mother and a child, or is there evidence that it's 50-50? What have you seen in terms of the
Because
parent?
of gender, 50-50 by gender.
Yeah, right.
That's a good question. I have seen it with fathers. I don't know if it is as problematic as between mothers and their daughters. Basically, when you think about it, I mean, Freud would love this.
Right.
Boys have to separate more from their mothers early on, because they aren't female. I'm not speaking about transgender issues or sexual orientation or anything at this point, but basically, little boys start orienting themselves more, a lot of them, with their fathers, and so you already have this dynamic. However, certainly it's not that older boys or sons don't feel like it's their duty to take care of their mother. Sometimes they do, but that emotional neediness might be more prevalent, I would think, with girls. And when you think about it developmentally, girls don't start separating from their moms until much later. I mean, psychologically separating. And so, that's why teenage girls are really can be quite difficult, because they are trying to separate. And so anything their mom does is just awful and horrible, and they hate them. So, but actually in enmeshed relationships, that doesn't happen. That kind of independence and that kind of seeing themselves as different than their moms are, it's much delayed in daughters who have enmeshed relationships with their mothers, because they don't want the conflict. There's a huge avoidance of conflict.
Interesting. Yeah, you just made me think of, I've heard this from some of my, or I've seen this. So I have a 15-year-old daughter. She's going to be 15 in a week after this interview. And then my son is 17 years old. And what I've seen is, with some of their friends, as they're in this stage of individuation from their parents, I've watched some of the guilt the parents have laid back on these kids, making comments like, well, you just don't like me anymore. You just don't like hanging out with me anymore. And I see these poor kids. And I watched this one weekend with one of my daughter's friends, and my heart broke, because he was so torn up. I mean, he just was eviscerated by the language from his father, who was like, because the child wanted to do what he wanted to do. He wanted to go hang out with friends. It's a normal thing. And but parents do have this withdrawal system, or process that they go through. And I just it's when you watch the children trying to do that, and then they get, this kid was crying to get back to his dad. No, dad, I don't mean that. And I'm just like, oh gosh, let me just,
It's really hard to watch. When it's that obvious, it's really hard to watch.
For sure. Now, you had said something about, that you had an enmeshed relationship with your own mother. How did that, if you don't mind talking a little bit about that, what did that look like, and how did you move through that, and out?
Well, I didn't even recognize it until, gosh, I'd been in therapy a long time. And in fact, a therapist asked me if I'd ever considered if my mother was manipulative, and I walked out of the session. I was so protective of her that I couldn't even hear a word like that attached to her, because she did love me very well in many ways. She did, except it just was over the top. It was overprotective. There was no boundary. And so I was in my 30s before I recognized that a lot of the things I was allowing my mother into in my life was really choking me. I mean, it was just not appropriate. The things I would invite her to do because I thought she'd enjoy them. She'd enjoy living my life with me, basically, was my thought. And yet that wasn't fair to me. That wasn't happening with my peers, but I couldn't see it until actually, sadly, I had two marriages break up. And in both those marriages, my mother was a problem. Now, there were other problems. One of them was actually abusive. But I kept hearing this, your relationship with your mother is weird. Your relationship with your mother is weird. And I finally went, my relationship with my mother is weird. So, and I remember actually trying to save my second marriage. I did confront her. It was a very difficult thing for her to hear and for me to say. And we actually never talked about it again. And there are other aspects of that are important. But it was very difficult. And her feelings were tremendously hurt, just like I'd assumed they would be. And but I knew I was doing the right thing. So, but I felt I was a sickly kid, and so some of it was set up because my mother, my doctor told my mother, now again, this might not have been really true, maybe my mother's interpretation, that she needed to go with me if I ever went out of town, for example, on a choir tour, that, I had these medical problems and she needed to be there to watch. And so literally the first night that I ever spent away from my mother, if I wasn't at a trusted friend's house, but I didn't go to camp, I didn't do any of those things, was when I went to college.
Wow. And
I was told by her, well, you may not be able to do this. And I went, by damn, I'm going to do it. Because I could feel the stricture. I could feel how tight those bonds were. But I'd become so accustomed to them that I saw them as normal until I got older and older and older and realized, wow, this is causing problems. So, from her point of view, she had not had a good relationship with her mother, quite the opposite of what we were talking about earlier. When this is handed down from generation to generation, she saw it as loving me with all her heart and sacrificing for me and going out of her way to be an attentive, loving mom. The problem was she didn't see that. I mean, she would talk to me about the problems between herself and my dad in a very inappropriate way. I've laughed that I became a therapist because I was my mother's therapist.
Right. Some truth there, though, right?
Yeah. And in fact, I had a therapist say, it's time for your mother to get her own therapist. So all those bonds were very difficult to break because I felt like I was abandoning her and doing something wrong. But I gradually realized, and thank goodness I did, for her and for myself. Well, I'm not so sure she was too happy about it, but certainly for myself, I needed to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I got to tell you that when I was reading through your bio on the website there, you made a comment and it resonated with me. And I think if we were looking at the two poles of the families, right, the one where it's centripetal, it's all moving inward, or centrifugal, I felt on the centrifugal side really pushed out, except, for a variety of tasks that I had to attend to as the oldest daughter with younger brothers and in dealing with an emotional, immature mother that was, I would never have defined her as being like a true narcissist, but definitely that emotional immaturity made it a lot about her and not about, other things. And
that's
so
a really good point to make, that it's very immature.
Yeah. And so, and that comes from talking to amazing people like you and becoming more educated. But one of your comments that just struck me was, it says here, I began writing online in 2012, and I was just narcissistic enough to believe that I might have something funny or fresh to share. And what drew me to that was the fact that that's kind of the mentality that I have. Like when you get in a dynamic like this and you're swallowed or ignored both, right? It's one or the other. You
Yeah.
feel like you have something to prove. Not everybody has that mindset, and that comes down to probably the DNA and the mix of the experiences and the mix of whatever it is that makes it. But, I was like, yeah, I've made that comment myself. Like, it takes a degree of narcissism to think that you're good enough to do a show, for example, or write a book, or, that what you have to share with the world is better than what's already out there in some way.
It was very interesting. I mean, when I told my mom, I was a professional singer in my 20s, and so I completely turned things around in about 8 or 9 years to become a clinical psychologist. But when I told my mom that I was going to do that, I guess she thought about it for a while, and she called me and said, "Margaret, I think you're a little too judgmental to be a therapist." And you could hear that as soon as I was approaching the idea that maybe I could be powerful in my own right and that I could forge ahead and create a career, that it was very either scary to my mom, or she wanted to dampen my enthusiasm for it. She just could not see that I was going to do something important to me and hopefully help other people. And actually, she was talking about herself.
Right.
So she was far more judgmental. I'm sure I have been in my lifetime. We all do it to a certain extent, but
Mm-hmm.
I can say that I'm not judgmental.
Well, and you described this relationship, which, was triggering for me because it sounded very, very similar to my personal experiences with this dynamic.
Sure.
And when you had originally defined, that's okay. Like, I deal with being triggered a lot as I do the show, so it's it's what therapy does for you, is it helps you through that. But when you described the original definition of enmeshment as this overt display of, you make me feel, I get this from you, kind of languaging. I wasn't seeing that. And then when you told your story, that's what I had seen and experienced, which was this parent who felt like they needed to step in because they didn't have the close relationship with their own mother, and needed to just take their arms around their child and be there everywhere. And so as you're talking about going on trips and not having, having your mom there, I'm thinking about this individual that I'm thinking about, how mom was there for everything. And what happened to this person, sadly, was they had this love-hate relationship inside of themselves. And I wanted to talk about narcissism, because how this individual ended up like kind of evolving was because they seem to be linked together. And that's why I said your comment about narcissism, makes sense. But of course, when we can call ourselves a narcissist, we're not. But they seem like that enmeshment is this complete erosion of the autonomy of the child. And that when they're overwhelmed by their parents' involvement in every aspect, that there's this subconscious, revolt against it. And so, what I noticed in this family was that this wanting to be free, but yet still heavily reliant and not knowing how to free themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I could see this person deal with the inner shame of being torn by that, like being really resentful that they didn't want mom around all the time, and mom was around all the time. And if you had a conversation with her about boundaries, she got her feelings hurt, she'd throw the silent treatment around, and then she'd creep right back in, and you'd have to just sit there and go, the hell, like, how you can't even address it, like, and the intent on the outside, like you said, on the outside, people are like, oh, you have a great relationship, but it's like, when you're in it, it was there, it was coming over to the house whenever they felt like it. And even if you said, listen, don't, like, there needs to be space here, validating it for whatever their reasons were. And the validation was always love. And I honestly believed with this particular parent that truly was the motivation. But because there was no way of having any empathy and seeing what the consequences of that was, and I couldn't have a conversation with this person and say, let's talk about this, let's explore this need to be in every, hands in everything, in life. But once I saw this, and I saw this painful cycle watching it, and I saw everybody around it, I couldn't help but just understand just how torn this was. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
No, I think we have to be careful because enmeshment can actually occur in people who do not have personality disorders and can recognize, oh, I thought this was appropriate for me to do. Of course, I need to back. I mean, I've not worked with many, but I have worked with a few mother-daughter pairs where there is an acknowledgement on the mother's part. Oh, wow, I'm really struggling with letting my son or my daughter go. And the transformation in their own lives is important because they get to look at their own lives as, well, I need to have a life. I need to have something that is really meaningful and fresh for me as I watch my daughter or son leave. So that's a gift that person can give themselves. But when you cross over into the parent is also having either narcissistic or borderline kind of dynamics or character traits, then that's when that sort of lack of empathy and emotional chaos can become even more pronounced through the enmeshment, where someone with narcissistic tendencies will more see their child as someone that they need that child to be there for them when they need them, and when it's sort of like on call, you're on call.
Mm-hmm.
A borderline parent will probably dish out a bunch more about, or borderline traded with traits will dish out more about how if you want to do something without them, you're abandoning them. Now, maybe a narcissistic parent would do that too. There's some people who sadly qualify or fit some criteria for both, and those people are really tragically confused.
Mm-hmm.
But their offspring is even more confused.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a woman who actually, and this will get your attention to something, she started to see me because she had been sexually abused by her therapist.
Wow.
And she was quite devastated by that. She finally recognized what was going on. He lost his license, and this was a couple of years after that before she even dared to trust a therapist. And she came in and we worked on those dynamics. But then I started hearing about a relationship with her mom. And sure enough, what had been set up in that mother-daughter relationship was no boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it was reenacted with the therapist, she was blind to what was going on, because what had happened was he had groomed her like a lot of sexual abusers do, and she just hadn't seen it coming. And a lot of it was because of the context with her mom. So I think that what this enmeshment can set you up for is, we all, when we seek loving relationships, we define love by what's familiar. Mm-hmm. We define love by usually, what happened in our own families that was called love. Now, sometimes if that's truly abusive and awful looking, we don't, but we'll try so hard to find the opposite that we can cause problems. But someone who's enmeshed, again, many of those people, like me, it took me until my early 30s to truly know what was going on. And I didn't realize that I was being attracted to the familiar. Mm-hmm. I was being attracted to men, for example, who did not have any boundaries with me and wanted a lot of control. Mm-hmm. And so that was problematic. So I do think that what needs attention and what needs awareness is, you may be thinking you're helping your child and that you want to be that involved with them, but your all parents are modeling what is an appropriate, healthy, kind of loving relationship to have. Mm-hmm. And then often that sculpts a child's understanding of what they need to seek, and that can be very sad.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of when you hear couples complaining or women complaining that their husband wants them to act like they're his mom.
Yeah. Sure.
and that was part of my experience in this particular situation, was that ultimately the the relationship devolved to where there was an expectation that I would be there all the time, put everything else on hold, provide money when needed,
Oh,
not ask
sure.
any questions,
Sure.
but yet it was resentful. I mean, and so it made it emotionally painful, toxic, and abusive when
Mhm.
there was no compliance to this standard that had been set by the enmeshed mother, you know? I mean, and it was tough. Yeah. You took a deep breath in, so I totally want to hear what you have to say about that.
Again, I want to stress, maybe even some people listening are saying, but what's wrong with this? What's wrong with a parent wanting to help their child? What's wrong with uh, giving and being interested and caring? And gosh, I wish my parent had done that for me. They said I'd never amount to anything. I think it's what happens more subtly that's a problem. This same woman who was sexually abused by her therapist told me a story about her mom that now she's a little older than I am, and so you know she was a child way or a college student way before cell phones and all that stuff. But her mother would send her packages of clothes at her college, and her roommates and dorm mates would say, "Wow, God, I wish my mom would send me packages." But the sad thing was, and there were tears that came to her eyes, she said, I would open it, and they were all clothes that my mother thought I would look good in,
Oh gosh.
not clothes that I might have chosen myself. And so if I didn't wear them, I wasn't appreciating what she'd done for me. If I did wear them, I felt so strange and like I was trying to put on the persona that my mother wanted for me instead of the one that was really me. And that kind of subtlety is hard for people sometimes to have, because it can look like bounty, it can look like caring, it can look like it can really dress itself up as something far healthier than it is.
Yeah, I took my own deep breath in when you said that, because reflecting back on my own personal life, and like I said, I had the centrifugal push, but part of that was my own energy of pushing myself out, because I did have these this mom who tried to do that, but we were so different, and I recognized my own individuality as, from an intellectual standpoint, we weren't close together, like, and things. She was deeply connected with her own parents, like lived in the same town, took care of her mom all the time, took care of her
Sure.
parents all the time. She actually, this is my own mother. You could see outside, separation of years in therapy, how her preference was to be in that family dynamic, playing the role of the little sister and taking care of the parents and all that other. And so when she would do this, I remember actually being in tears myself in high school, trying to pick out the dress I was going to wear at my high school graduation. And I found the dress I wanted, and I put it on, and I loved it. And my mom just hated it, wanted me to try on something that I thought was just dumpy and terrible looking, and refused to buy me the dress I wanted, because she just insisted that this other dress was like the better dress. And I
Yeah.
left the store crying. And finally an aunt had said, dear God, like, just get her the dress. Like, I mean, why are you, like, it was that emotional. And I would get the same thing.
Sure.
I'd get these packages, like a sweatshirt. I'm like, God, I would never wear this whole thing. But I could see how she couldn't distinguish. She never saw who I really was. Like, it was
Yeah.
all she saw was this little version of this mini version of her reflecting back. And so the enmeshment didn't happen because I just early on just couldn't do it. I couldn't play along with it because I felt so strongly about who I was.
Sure.
Kind of like,
Well, I'm also thinking about my dad's role in this. And my mom actually developed a prescription drug addiction. And when she left to go address it, she had to get off the drugs many years later. Uh, my brothers and I had some pretty honest conversations with our dad. And one of the things I asked him was, Dad, every time I would call, which was frequent,
mm-hmm.
he'd go, hey, Margaret, let me go get your mom. I mean, there there wasn't a, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? Are you okay? It was just, hey, Chris, let me get your mom. And I looked at him and I said, I never could I never could understand that. And he looked at me and he just got this very sad look on his face. And he goes, Margaret, I knew your mother needed you. And so from his perspective, he was taking care of his wife by sort of seeing this, seeing my role in meeting her needs where maybe he felt like he couldn't. And so that he didn't enable, well, I guess it is sort of enabling it. Later, the older I got, the more he and I developed our own relationship, which was at my insistence, really. And we had a great relationship, but it took me, I was living in Little Rock, Arkansas, and my family's from Southern Arkansas. And I can remember calling my dad when I was 22 or 23 and saying, I'd like to have lunch with you. And he goes, well, let me ask Bet. That's Bet. Betty was her name. Let me ask Bet if we can come. And I said, no, Dad, I want to have lunch with you. Well, my mother was so upset. Why wasn't she invited? And what were we going to talk about? And this, that, and the other. And so I told him at that lunch, I want a relationship with you. And this was long before the conversation about the telephone call. So gradually we began building our own relationship, but it was very difficult to do so.
Oh, I can imagine. Now, what are some of the other outcomes for adults who grow up with an enmeshed parent? I'm curious about whether or not codependency becomes a danger, or love addiction, or, we talked a little bit about narcissism. That's probably an extreme case, but I imagine, there may be some narcissistic tendencies because of just, when you have chances to individuate, you do. Sometimes at the, making, I call them poor choices, but, they might rub somebody the wrong way. But, is there any common, kind of outcomes that people that have dealt with an enmeshed relationship will kind of express out in adulthood and in personal relationships or life?
Sure. I think the most important thread of all that, no matter what it might look like diagnostically, is that your boundaries are just really screwed up. And if you don't recognize it and really work on it. So if it goes unseen and unidentified, then you will enter the world believing, one, that you're that important to everybody, and or that other people have the right to say what they think about your life, or it's just that you don't, again, I'll use a simple phrase that I used before. You don't know where you begin and where you end and other people begin. So you either can become needy yourself and maybe even manipulative yourself in order to set up these kinds of dynamics with people, that you want them to be there for you, or vice versa, that it's okay that you're supposed to be there all the time for them. Or you can struggle so with independence and making good choices that you just kind of go from chaotic relationship to chaotic relationship. And I'm not sure that I know exactly, are there the three specific outcomes from enmeshment. I just think it's probably, one, it's very dependent on your awareness of it and how hard you've worked on it, to be able to know that you are you're establishing much clearer expectations with people of what's okay with you and what's not. And they can with you. So like all adult children, we all have to watch whether we're recreating what was created for us, or whether we're trying so hard not to that we overdo it.
Swing the other direction. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There probably is some scholarly article out there that talks about the three basic things that happen with enmeshment, but I've seen a lot of different things. So I think it's a bit more diverse than that.
I would agree with that. Yeah. And I think that the big thing you struck right on it, which is the boundary violation. And again, a lot of people that have dealt with a variety of childhood adversities and childhood traumas tend to really have a lot of issues with the boundary part of it, for sure. You don't have to have an enmeshed parent relationship to also still have a boundary issue. And so, that's where, definitely learning that. And I've experienced people too that just, have a hard time learning then how to express and hold those boundaries and not having all that shame. And I call it the wobble inside,
Oh,
the
yeah.
really the discomfort with that. And, I was talking with somebody recently and we were talking about, improvement in assertiveness. And I just looked and I was like, if you're just now working on it, oh my God, I got something to tell you. Your life is drastically going to change. Like it's going to be amazing in a year. And they're just like, what? And I said, no, trust me. Life changes once you are able to understand what boundaries are.
Oh, yeah.
Love them, and then be able to speak and hold them over and over and over again and get past the internal discomfort to a point of where you realize that there are good relationships out there. There are good people out there that have an understanding of that. And the people that don't are truly people that you should keep at a distance, so that you can keep your sense of self there. So yeah, I don't need a diagnosis to know that. Yeah.
You can learn to say no.
Yeah. Oh, totally. So let's I want to have some time here because not only do you have
I'm
your
not
book.
crying because of the topic. I'm crying because I had a little coughing fit and my throat's dry, so I've got tears in my eyes.
That's okay. Now, I did mention this in the intro, but it is important. Which is that you do have a podcast yourself called SelfWork, and so people that love podcasts are obviously listening to this show. So I know that they'd be interested in learning more about you. So would you mind talking a bit about what that podcast is for and for people?
No, I'd love to. It's one of my favorite things that I do, actually. It's everywhere. It's on iTunes. It's on Spotify. It's on iHeartRadio. It's wherever. And I started doing it a little over 3 years ago because I, again, wanted to extend the walls of my practice. I started blogging 7 or 8 years ago because my son had gone to college and I had time to fill. And I also really love what I do. I'm very passionate about therapy. And I was tired of there being so much misinformation and ignorance about it. So I wanted to try to set forward what it might, what decent, hopefully even good therapeutic advice might look like. The podcast, as it has evolved, is I don't have guests. I've had a handful of guests, but I got feedback from my listeners that they felt as if they were talking with me or had a relationship with me, and then all of a sudden someone sort of butted in. So I said, well, that's not good. So it's not therapy. I mean, no podcast is therapy.
Right.
But I talk about different topics. I'm a very direct therapist. I always give people things to do and goals and assignments and recommendations. And so it offers a lot of practical, pragmatic suggestions of what I call what you can do about it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do something about everything, but often if we focus on what we can do, we're going to be much better. So I love doing it. I also have a listener email every day. I actually answer my emails and I have great diversity there. So we talk about everything from anxiety to panic to eating disorders to enmeshment to depression to perfectly hidden depression. There are all kinds of things that we can discuss. And so I love doing it. And then the book, Perfectly Hidden Depression, came about back in April of 2014 when I wrote a post called, I was just thinking about some people that I had seen over the years that we discovered they were depressed, but it took some digging. Mm-hmm. And they were very uncomfortable talking about it and even revealing it to themselves, very uncomfortable, and sometimes didn't even know how to use the language to talk about emotional pain. And I called it The Perfectly Hidden Depressed Person, Are You One? And it went viral. So I had hundreds of emails that came to me. This is me. I've never heard anybody talk about this. How'd you figure this out? And so I began researching and figuring out that Dr. Brene Brown's work, who's of course is outstanding, her work is just wonderful, but even she stopped before she made a true connection between perfectionism and depression, but it is definitely out there. Mm-hmm. Perfectionism has been known to be a problematic character trait for a long time. That's no new news, but what could be fresh news to people, and especially to mental health professionals, is that someone can be sitting right in front of you and have thoughts about hurting themselves on a regular basis and sit there and smile at you and never reveal that to you unless you absolutely ask the right question. Mm-hmm. And so we all sadly and tragically probably know someone who has died by suicide, who we saw in the grocery store last week or last month and looked great, or we heard great things about them. So as suicide rates rise, I want to really stress this because I think it is highly likely. In fact, I hear all the time from people who know someone, or even, traumatically, a son or a daughter, who said, I didn't understand why they had killed themselves until I read about perfectly hidden depression, because they had everything in the world going for them. Mm-hmm. Before this episode, you and I talked a little bit about how even enmeshment can lead to this kind of strategy to look perfect, and strategy to put others' needs in front of your own, and strategies to, and that just becomes so inherent in you that you don't even think about your own needs. So enmeshment is one of those roads to Rome about perfectly hidden depression. There are many, but enmeshment is one of them. So I have loved writing about it. The book came out about 3 months ago, and it's doing well. It's not a New York Times bestseller, certainly, but I'm an unknown therapist from Fayetteville, Arkansas. I don't live on the coast. I'm not with any university. So actually, for what it is, and that's basically, it's people are using word of mouth to get the word out. So, and I'm on podcasts like yours, which is absolutely wonderful.
Well, awesome.
So thank you for that.
Oh, for sure. And, sitting here thinking about it, I would love to, this is going to be the last episode of season 2. Sure. So you get to tail out my season, but I would love to actually have you back on to talk specifically about that. Perfectionism is a big deal. And like you've said, I think some people think about it more or less as anxiety, like, yes. I'm anxious about it.
Mental health professionals included. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so when you said that, I was like, yeah, usually when people talk about perfectionism, they're talking about the anxiety with it, and not the fact that, there's a root of depression that's actually in there. So I think it would be powerful, and would, one of the things that, as a Gen X person, there is a growing like existential crisis in our generation, because we are the latchkey kids. We didn't have a lot of parental involvement, but yet we were go-getters and entrepreneurs, and, a lot of the, big movements, and some of the things that our kids think that they invented, don't realize that Gen X invented, is kind of coming home to roost. And, what do you do next? Sure. Everything seems so great. And, when you talk about, like you said, suicide is a huge topic for me to cover, especially when you think about that the largest growing, fastest group is men my age.
Yes, you're right.
And women still attempting to die by suicide to the tune of about 1 million a year, in the same bandwidth there. It's hugely important. So yeah, I would be honored to be able to pick that discussion up and share
that is a topic I can talk for hours about. So.
I believe it. A lot of these topics are, it's just like, where's the beer, the wine, or the water, and let's go. So, well, and so everybody, I think that, as you probably heard on this episode here with Margaret, she is a plain speaker. She'll get to the point. I think that if any of you are looking for a show that might resonate with you, I think that's why people listen to this and to me, is by being very direct, straightforward. And so I would encourage you to check out what she's got there, and also the book. And I want to say thank you for your time.
Oh, you're so welcome. We had a little bit of just so your listeners know, I got sick and then sick again, and we had to cancel. So you've been very patient. So I'm delighted to be here with you. And gosh, I'm just about 2 hours from you.
I know. Yeah. She ended up taking a trip up to Seattle, which is just real close to Snohomish. And so we're almost kind of in the same room.
Yeah,
so,
we are.
Anyways, well, thank you again, Margaret. I'll let you go. I know your husband's been sitting quietly in the background, so you guys can have your room back together. So tell him thank you as well for his patience with us. Of course. And it was a pleasure meeting him.
I'll tell him you thanked him. That'll be great.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So thank you again. It was awesome.
Of course. Thank you.